This is There I Find Family, a Strawberry Sands Beach sweet romance novella. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Part 1. Chapter 1. Lana Landry walked up the beach, smiling as the lighthouse near Raspberry Ridge came into view. She lifted her face to the spring breeze, chilly and bracing, which blew in from Lake Michigan. Like many people, spring was her favorite season. The long, harsh winter was over, and long, warm summer days filled with sand, swimming, and fun lay ahead. Only this year, things could be different. Her heart twisted a little. She'd been contemplating a decision for a while, had been turning it over and over in her mind. She thought she knew what God wanted her to do, and normally she didn't dilly-dally when God opened a door. In fact, most of the time she'd eagerly run through the doors he'd opened. But this door was harder than the rest. She smiled as 3 children, long skinny legs and, even at this early date in the year, tanned faces, came rushing toward her from the lighthouse just up the way. Their legs churned over sand dunes and the sparse grass that cropped up further back on the beach as the kids came rushing toward her. She'd been visiting Pianse's foster children at least once a month all winter, but it had been more than a month since her last visit. "Miss Lana! Miss Lana!" the kids called as they ran toward her, their arms wide. She braced herself a little. She wasn't as young as she used to be. Mid-50s wasn't old, exactly, but it was older than she thought she'd be as she considered the decision she needed to make. As the kids reached her, she caught a glimpse of Pianse coming out, walking more slowly beside his father, Joe. Joe was the reason Lana had started coming up the beach to begin with. He had been living by himself at the lighthouse, and, like a good neighbor, she had been concerned about him and had checked in on him occasionally. It was the chocolate-covered espresso beans that had first alerted her to the fact that Joe had a son. Joe had offered her the beans, saying that his son, who owned and operated several businesses in Chicago, had sent them to him and he didn't care for them. Lana had become addicted after the first bite. From then on, when Pianse sent chocolate-covered espresso beans, Joe had made sure that Lana had gotten them. "Mr. Pianse said we could swim today if you came," Callie said happily as she wrapped her arms around Lana's waist. At 10, Callie was the oldest of the 3 foster children. "I sure hope he doesn't think I'm going to get in that freezing cold water. You do know that it's a lot warmer outside than it is in the water." "We know. It doesn't matter. We want to swim." Florence, who was 8 years old, wrapped her arms around Lana's waist and squeezed tight. "I haven't forgotten how," August said. He was the only boy and the youngest at 6. He was also the least afraid of anything, and quite a handful. Pianse had earned more than a few gray hairs since August had come into his life. The thought made Lana smile. Pianse had been stayed, and maybe even stuck in a rut. The children had loosened him up some. Still, 3 children was a lot for a man who was nearing his 60th year of life. Lana had been thinking for a while that the Lord wanted her to offer to help him, maybe hire on as a nanny, but that would mean leaving Strawberry Sands and the town she loved. Every one of her children lived there. It wasn't like Raspberry Ridge was so far away, but it felt like it sometimes. Still, Lana had lived long enough to know that if God wanted to move her, she'd better go, because that was the way to true happiness. doing what God wanted, even if it felt like something she would never want to do on her own. "Can we wade in the water?" Callie asked, peeking hopefully up at Lana. "You need to ask Mr. Pierce," she said, smiling a little at the idea that she would be able to give them permission. The children had treated her almost like a mom since the first time she met them. It was kind of funny, and made Lana feel even more like what God wanted her to do was exactly what she was supposed to. Not that the children were perfect, but they were so sweet and innocent, and they just wanted a family to love them. Of course, one could figure that they wanted their own family, not a patched-together one. But sometimes what a person wanted wasn't what they got. "Oh, yes," August said, turning around and running as fast as his little legs would carry him to where Pierce and Joe were just coming around the dunes. The girls chattered around her, and she smiled, answering their questions and nodding as they told her what they had been doing on their Saturday morning. August's cheer of happiness broke into their conversation, and the girls turned as their brother ran straight from Pierce directly into the waves, calling as he did so, "We can go to our knees!" The girls took after their brother, and Lana smiled at them. The air temperature was a balmy 80, which felt positively hot after the frigid temperatures of winter. It was the first 80-degree day of the year, and it felt like a heat wave. However, from experience, Lana knew that Lake Michigan would be nowhere near that warm. But her own children had been the same way. They could hardly wait to get back in the water after a year of winter days that were too cold to swim. After 45 minutes of swimming, give or take, the children would come out, shivering with blue lips and goosebumps all over their skin, but smiling and happy. Also hungry. Nothing made a child hungrier than to swim in cold water. "Hey there, haven't seen you for a while," Pierce said as he and his father got closer. Lana turned from watching the children wade at the edge of the lake to smile at the man who had become a very good friend to her. "I'm sorry. We had Easter and then several big conferences back to back, and the bed and breakfast has been packed." "I know. It's just good to see you." She texted him occasionally, although they didn't have a daily time when they talked. Still, she was comfortable enough with him that she could pick up her phone and call or text any time. "Hey there, girlie. I'm on my way to go fishing. If you want to come, you just mosey on over. I have a chair set up for you." Joe didn't hug her. He wasn't that kind of man. But he nodded over where there were 3 chairs set at the spot where he usually spent most of his days beside the lake, with a line or 3 in the water. Lana glanced at Pierce, who had a small smile on his face, but she couldn't tell if that was what he wanted to do. "Maybe I'll be over," Lana said, and Joe nodded, giving his son a lifted brow before he began to shuffle over to the chairs. "He loves fishing," Pierce said as they watched him go. "He says he never catches anything, but he always has fish on the line." "I think that's the way all fishermen are. It's bad luck to say you got more than you need." "He's shared with me more than once, and I've appreciated it." "He's generous." "And you inherited that trait," Lana said as their eyes met, and Pierce took her compliment, an expression that might have been pleasure moving across his face before disappearing. They turned together without saying anything to watch the children as they frolicked in the shallow water. "I don't understand how they can stand that. It's so cold." Pierce gave an exaggerated shudder as they moved forward to a small rise in the sand. "There's just something about being shut up and away from the water all winter that makes children willing to endure a lot of hardship in order to swim." She wasn't sure she could explain it, but she knew from experience that was how her children were. "Do you want to sit here for a bit?" Pianse asked as they reached the top of the rise. "Okay." The sand was warm as she lowered herself down. Her knee ached, and her back gave her twinges. She definitely felt her age in the aches and pains of her body, which made her admire Pianse all the more. He had decided to foster these children, and the last she heard he was working on adopting them. She admired that. He wasn't just living life for himself, but had looked around to see what he could do to help others. It was one of the many things she appreciated about him. The more time she spent with him, the more things she found to admire. They sat in silence for a while as the laughter of the children drifted up and Lana lifted her face to the sun. Pianse shifted beside her and she looked over. "Are you going a little stir-crazy with the children inside?" "I can't say I'm disappointed spring is here." "Has there been much accomplished on the house?" she asked. The last time they talked, he had said that he was building a house in Raspberry Ridge where he owned property. "I'd like to take you to see it later if you'd like." Her eyes opened wide. "Today?" "I've already talked to Dad. Once the kids are out of the water, I've got some lunch ready for them, and then, if you have time." He looked hopeful, or at least that's the way she thought he looked, and she nodded before she thought about it. She had the entire day off. Her children had insisted, since she had been working so hard with the conventions that had been held in Strawberry Sands. The whole town was excited that they were finally getting some of the Chicago business Blueberry Beach usually did. With the construction of the inn, and with the school that had opened, and the horses were a big draw too, Strawberry Sands seemed to be on people's radars. And she was leaving. Maybe. "Absolutely. I have the whole day off, and I was thinking that I would spend most of it here." "All of us will love that, and we might end up keeping you longer than you want, but I can drive you home if it gets too late." "All right." She looked back out at the water and smiled as Florence stood with her arms wrapped around herself, but she didn't seem to want to allow the cold to drive her out of the water. "Are the kids enjoying school?" "I think that was one of the best decisions I've ever made. Pulling them out of public school and putting them in the private school in Strawberry Sands. They really seem to be thriving." "It's not going to be that much further of a drive from your place in Raspberry Ridge." "It's not." He let out a breath. "Is it terrible that I'm a little bit afraid of summer vacation? I mean, I'm looking forward to spending more time with the kids. They're fun." He laughed a bit. "I never thought I'd actually say that, but it's true. I have such a great time with them. But all day long every day?" "You'd mentioned that before, and I've been thinking about it." He looked surprised as he turned to face her. "You have?" Lana met his eyes for a moment before she looked back out at the lake. She didn't need to look at him to see the rugged set of his jaw, the hair that was tinged with silver, the piercing blue eyes, strong nose, the hairline that was receding. He didn't look younger than his age, but he didn't look older either. He had struck her when she first saw him as a hard businessman, determined to be successful, and maybe a little ruthless. She didn't really see much of that in him at all anymore. With her heart pounding and her stomach churning, she dug her fingers into the sand behind her and said as casually as she could, "I thought I might help you." Chapter 2. Pianse stared at Lana. He was too old to be captivated by a woman. He thought he had known everything there was to know about women. that a man had to be careful around them, careful about what he said, what he did, careful how he said things. They could pick up on the least thing and make a mountain out of something he didn't even realize he'd implied. He got himself in trouble more than once, and while he had longed for years for someone to walk beside him through life, he hadn't been trying very hard to find that someone. It just seemed so complicated and difficult, and every time he tried, he seemed to come up short. It was hard on a man's ego, especially a man who was used to being successful in every area of his life. He had been a successful businessman, a successful part of the Chicago political scene, and a successful patron of the arts and many charities. But Lana had challenged him in a way that few people ever had. She had given him some straight talk when he desperately needed it. He never doubted it came from the Lord, because in his interactions with Lana after that day where she challenged him to give up his cushy life and to do something that actually mattered, he realized that she wasn't typically that type of woman. But her words had struck a chord deep inside of him, a chord that had needed to be struck for a while. Because his life was selfish. He spent his days working for himself, earning money that he could spend on his own at his own leisure. His one daughter didn't take much time, and while he tried to have a relationship with her, she preferred to spend more time with her mother. Which had been fine with Pianse. That had given him more time to work on his businesses and enjoy his leisure. But Lana had stepped in his life and challenged everything he did with a few short words. Then she walked back out like she hadn't just changed his life. He'd been fascinated by her ever since, and even before. She was the kind of woman that a man just looked at twice and then wished she was his. At least, that's the way he felt about her. But she had a family of her own, a life she'd established and was happy in, and he doubted she would be interested in merging that life with his. Except she kept coming around, more to see his dad than anything else. She'd somehow managed to finagle her way into his dad's heart, which truly said something, since there weren't too many people his dad gave room to. Lana was one of the few. But being that she spent so much time with his dad, it made him want to spend more time with him too, and it made him realize life was short and his dad wasn't going to live forever. And then, when she challenged him to do more, he just so happened to stop at a light in Chicago where there was a sign along the walk asking for foster parents. It was kind of funny the way the Lord worked things out sometimes. Because of Lana, the thought of being a foster parent had been on his mind, and then that sign, and then the next thing he knew, he'd done the research, taken their training, and had signed up for siblings. And they'd given him siblings. 3. Now he couldn't imagine his life without them. But somehow, through it all, Lana had been in the back of his head the whole time. And now she had offered to help? He'd been tempted to ask her more than once, to ask her for a little more than that. Maybe he hadn't expected things to move quite so quickly with the foster children and the situation there. Maybe he thought that Lana would be coming along for the ride, or that they would have time to grow closer. But with him wrapping up his businesses, moving to live with his dad at the lighthouse temporarily until his house was ready, and then with the children coming, he hadn't had time to pursue a relationship, because that's what he wanted. He just hadn't been sure if that was what Lana wanted. But he reminded himself not to get his hopes up. She was all about the children. "Help with the kids?" he said, knowing that he heard her correctly, but not sure exactly what she meant.
I didn't know if you were interested in a nanny, perhaps.
A nanny? Knowing that he sounded ridiculous because he kept repeating everything she said. But this was exactly what he wanted. Well, not exactly, but closer to what he wanted than what he had. You would do that?
I've been thinking about it. I guess the Lord laid it on my heart to offer.
But that would mean leaving Strawberry Sands.
I know.
And the bed and breakfast. You've been there for years. That's since
I got married. That was almost 35 years ago.
And all your children are there. Her smile was soft and her eyes amused as she turned to face him, still keeping her head tilted so the sun hit her skin.
If you're trying to talk me out of it, you don't have to. Just say no.
Yes, I want you. I had considered more than once asking you, but I didn't because I know how close you are to your family and your children. I didn't want to take you away from that and from the bed and breakfast as well.
I appreciate your consideration, but I've been praying about this since the night of the beach bash, when you told me that these were your foster children and you were going to start working on adopting them.
I got a little stuck on them. It just seems like I would not be doing them a favor if I brought them into a home where they didn't have a mom and a dad. A child should have both.
I agree,
Lana said easily, although maybe there was some kind of hidden meaning behind her words. He didn't want to look at them too closely, didn't even really think about it, since he was so excited and happy that Lana had volunteered to help him with the kids. I have been a little bit worried about doing this on my own. This winter has been full of learning experiences for both me and the children.
I'm sure. The rest of your life will probably be like that. My kids were born into my house, and I still felt like I barely survived some winters. I don't know why the summers are easier.
She chuckled a little, not necessarily because it was funny, but just because. So it gets easier. He had been worried about having the children home all the time.
I suppose it's relative.
There was still humor in her tone.
And I suppose it also depends on what the summer brings. But maybe it's because you're not stuck in the house together all the time. Or maybe it's just the dark that makes things so much harder.
Or the cold.
That's true. And the snow and ice and wind and all those fun things.
After he thought for a minute, he had to add, I wouldn't trade Michigan for anywhere. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I love it here. He looked out over the lake, and he knew, for him, living beside it was better than living in Florida, where it was sunny all year. But Lana already knew that. At least, he assumed she did, since she was still there too. Of course, she hadn't been as blessed as he had in life, and maybe she'd never had enough money to move somewhere else.
I love it here too, she said, as though she was listening to his thoughts.
The children still played in the water, laughing and squealing and chasing each other, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer. It couldn't. The water had to be freezing.
Sometimes, especially on the dark days of winter, I would think that it would be nice to live somewhere warmer, but I've never had the urge to pack up and go.
I've had the urge to pack up and leave the city, but I've never had the urge to pack up and leave the lake.
Right, I can understand that.
She gave him a glance.
I wondered if you chose to move here because you didn't want to raise your kids in the city.
I guess I just think that there are some important things they need to learn here, and there are a lot of things that I don't want them to learn there." She nodded and didn't ask any more. He figured she didn't need to. "What exactly did you have in mind?" he finally said, when she didn't speak at all. He wanted to know what she had meant about being a nanny.
"I guess whatever you need, or want, since you seem to be doing really well on your own."
"I want to adopt the children." Those words came out without him thinking, but he couldn't take them back, and he didn't want to, so he just kept talking. "That was actually my thoughts to begin with. I mean, I went through all the training to be a foster parent, but I can't imagine shuffling kids from house to house. Although I suppose there's a place for foster parents to take care of children until their parents are able to. That's a little different."
"Yes, I agree. A temporary situation where parents can't take care of their children for whatever reason. That's different than children who are looking for a new home."
"A permanent home. I was up front with the foster agency when I spoke with them. I didn't want to be a temporary home. I wanted to be a permanent stopping point."
"And are Callie and Florence and August looking for a permanent home?"
"Yes. Their mother is dead and their father is in prison. He signed away his rights, and they were being raised by a variety of relatives."
"I see. That's sad. But they seem so happy."
It's amazing how resilient children are, but you also wonder how much of that is going to mark them.
"True."
"But I didn't want to adopt them."
"You didn't?"
Lana said, her brows drawn down as she gazed at him, as though trying to figure out what he was saying, since he just seemed to say the opposite. "No, it seemed like it was unfair to have them be in a home with just a father. They deserve both a mom and dad." He held his breath and clamped down on his tongue. What he wanted to say was that he had been tempted over the few months that he had the kids to ask if she would be interested in being a mom to them. That wasn't all he wanted to ask her, because being a mom to his children would mean being married to him. It seemed like a backdoor way to get a woman to marry him, and it wasn't exactly an area he had any experience in. He never considered adopting children before, and he certainly never considered asking anyone to be a mom to his adopted children. It was all so strange, and not the way the world worked.
"I can't disagree with that. Although I raised my children with no dad, and while I do think that they felt the hole in our family, some of them more than others, it was the best I could do."
I think there's a big difference between what you did, where you didn't have a choice. Your husband left you. You couldn't exactly decide at that point whether or not you wanted to continue to have children and to raise them by yourself. She chuckled, but it was without humor.
"That's true."
"This is different. I would be deliberately bringing children into a home with no mother, and while the adoption agency and the foster groups have told me that I'm allowed to do so, as long as I take the training and my house passes inspection, I just feel that's not the best for them, and I've always been about doing what's best." Her lips curved up in a smile, and his heart turned over. It wasn't that Lana was so beautiful when she smiled. She was middle-aged, and she looked it, from the fine lines around her eyes to the age spots on her face, and her hair that had lost its youthful sheen and the figure that had lost its youthful slimness. Still, somehow her smile had the power to turn his heart over and render him speechless.
"You seem like the kind of person who makes sure that everything you do is done to the best of your ability. I admire that."
It took him an embarrassing long time to realize that he was staring at her, and he yanked his eyes away. "Thanks. He mumbled, knowing it was way too late.
"What's the matter?" she asked, and her words were gentle.
He shook his head. He could hardly tell her that he had been staring at her, not really paying that much attention to what she said. He couldn't believe that she didn't know, that she wasn't thinking that he was crazy, or maybe figuring out that he wanted her as more than a nanny. Nothing. But I guess as long as I have the children, I would really love to have you as a nanny, however that looks."
"It's not that far between Strawberry Sands and Raspberry Ridge, but a nanny implies someone who lives with the children."
"That's what I would prefer."
"I was going to ask."
Neither one of them could say anything more as their conversation was interrupted by Florence.
"I'm hungry. No, I'm starving," she said,
drawing out the word starving, like she was dying. August was behind her complaining of the same thing. Callie, slightly more mature than her siblings at 10 years old, walked behind them, her arms wrapped around herself as though that would keep her warm. "Would you like to come in? I know Dad's going to want to stay out and fish, and he probably wouldn't mind your company, but I would like it too." He wasn't used to children interrupting him when he was in the middle of conversations. He had so much more he wanted to say to Lana, so much more he wanted to hear her say to him. He could talk to her all day long and not be tired of it. But he couldn't be irritated with his kids. They were just telling him what they needed and expecting him to help them and to meet their needs. That was what he was there for.
"I'd love to come up. I want to talk to your dad and you, but I was serious about being a nanny."
"Maybe we can talk about it later while we're looking at the house." She nodded, and they pushed themselves off the ground as the children reached them. They were soaking wet from the waist down. Even though they were only supposed to be up to their knees, they had splashed up the water, and he even thought he'd seen August sitting down in it. The boy was completely soaked, and if Pianse was a more experienced father, he probably would have thought to bring towels out. "Let's get you guys inside. You can get dried off, and we'll get something warm in those bellies."
"Can we go swimming later?"
Florence asked, her teeth chattering, her lips blue. "We'll see," he said, knowing that he didn't really want them in the water when the only one watching them was his dad. His dad was very responsible and a great swimmer, but Pianse himself was overwhelmed sometimes with the three of them. He wouldn't want to do that to his dad. Not in the water. Callie had already taken Lana's hand, and she skipped alongside, chattering away as Lana nodded and smiled while they walked toward the lighthouse.
"Hey, wait up,"
Florence said, as she realized that her sister had walked with Miss Lana without her.
"I'm hungry,"
August said again, slipping his little hand into Pianse's and making his heart squeeze. The trust these children had in him. It was humbling and scary. He helped his wife raise their daughter, at least as long as they'd been married, and then he'd taken his turn at raising her, as much as their custody agreement would allow. But having 3 children was a lot different than just having one. 1 was easy. 3? Sometimes he panicked because he didn't know where all 3 of them were, not to mention the fighting. They bickered and argued with each other until he thought he would go insane. But they always made up, and any time someone outside of their family picked on them, they all ganged up together. It always made his heart smile to see how the siblings defended each other naturally, without him even having to train them in that. Maybe that had something to do with the way they'd been raised, and the way they hadn't had a very stable family, so they automatically formed their own. but he had a feeling that that might be the way siblings normally were, regardless of their parental situation. He put those thoughts out of his head and tried to focus on what August was saying to him. The blue sky, the warm breeze, the sand under his feet, and the laughter of the children, coupled with the fact that Lana was with them, made him determined to just enjoy each moment as it came. He was old enough to know that life went by fast, and these moments were precious and meant to be cherished. Especially since he didn't know how long Lana would stay. Chapter 3.
Are we there yet?
Lana smiled at the whine in Florence's voice. They'd only been on the road 10 minutes. But she expected a short ride, and apparently, to her anyway, 10 minutes was not short enough. Almost, just a couple more minutes.
It just takes so long,
she said, her voice indicating that she was close to expiring in the back seat.
So, did you guys get the swing set put up?
Lana asked, remembering that the last time she talked to them, they'd been excited because Pianse had told them that as the house went up, they were going to have a swing set up as well.
Yeah, that's why I'm so excited about going. We'll get to play in the swing set, and we don't have one at the lighthouse. I can't wait to move.
Pianse just smiled as he turned into the long lane that led back to their property on the bluffs. Raspberry Ridge was a small town, similar in size to Strawberry Sands, but on a ridge overlooking the lake, and there was no road to get to the beach. People had to take a trail down to the shore. It would probably never be as popular of a beachside town as what Blueberry Beach or Strawberry Sands was, just because there was no beachfront. Although, as they crested the small hill and came upon the few houses that were scattered along Main Street, Lana could appreciate the view. There was just something about being able to look out and down on that open space that made her feel light and happy. Pianse took a right at the end of the street and followed the bluffs for another quarter of a mile. The houses from town faded away, and the house he was building came into sight. There were no construction vehicles, probably because it was Saturday, but it looked like the house was pretty much done from the outside.
Well, it looks a lot different than what I had pictured.
It's a lot different than the last time we talked. They've got a lot of work done in the last 6 weeks. She wanted to ask how soon they'd be moving in, but she wasn't sure that he would want to talk about that in front of the children, so she waited. The kids had their doors open almost before Pianse had come to a full stop. Just make sure that if you're going to come in after playing outside, you don't track any mud in the house, okay? Pianse called after them. Callie shouted back an okay, while Florence just raised her hand, and August said something to the effect that he wasn't going to come in the house ever unless someone made him. Their youthful exuberance made Lana smile.
Once upon a time, we were young and had energy like that,
she said, and while there was a bit of a wistful note in her voice, she was happy for the wisdom that she had gained in the years since. I never really played on swing sets when I was a kid.
You're kidding.
Her eyes widened, and she looked at him in disbelief. He shrugged a shoulder. Nope, I don't recall ever doing anything like that.
What a life.
He grunted a little, but didn't elaborate. She figured that with him growing up at the lighthouse, he did other things, like fish with his dad, and they probably took a lot of boat rides as well. She supposed he would want that for his children, although he basically told her that he wasn't adopting them, which was a bit of an about-face, because he had been doing all the things necessary in order to get the paperwork through and call them his. She wondered what made him change his mind, or if it truly was just what he said, that he wouldn't be doing them a favor by bringing them into a single-parent home. He opened the door, and she stepped in. She had to stop, look around. It looked like it was entirely finished, and it was beautiful. It consisted of an open floor plan where she could see the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen all from where she stood. "Wow," she breathed, taking a moment to absorb the high ceilings, the comfortable-looking couches and chairs, and the well-appointed kitchen. She toed her shoes off while he did the same. "Was that a good wow or a bad wow?" he asked with a small laugh. "A good one. This is amazing. I guess I don't really know what I expected, but it feels so warm and welcoming. Yet the high ceilings make it feel spacious and accommodating as well." "I guess after spending the winter in the lighthouse, which is small, as you know, and not very bright since there aren't a lot of windows, I really wanted something that was not claustrophobic, not in any way." "I think you succeeded, and I love it. Although the kitchen looks really fantastic." "I thought you might like it, considering how much cooking you do at the bed and breakfast." She slipped him a look, not sure if he was saying what it sounded like he was, that he had been thinking of her as he planned his kitchen. That was not something she had expected, but it made her heart do a little happy dance and feel warm and fuzzy. She walked slowly in, moving beside him as he allowed her to just look. The colors were mostly neutral, some warm brown wood tones with a few accent colors, mostly greens and blues. It made things feel soft and inviting and relaxing at the same time. It was definitely a home where people could walk in and feel welcome and comfortable. "It looks like it's completely done," she said as they moved into the kitchen. "It is. I'm just waiting for the occupancy permit and the last inspection. I didn't want the kids to get too excited because sometimes these things move slowly." "It's going to be hard for them to leave this." She stopped at the table and put a hand on it, while he sighed. "I've been thinking of a solution, but I wasn't sure how you feel about it." His eyes lifted to hers, and he seemed to be judging her facial expression as though basing his next words off of how she looked, or maybe how he thought she felt. "I'm not sure what you're saying, why it would matter how I felt, but go on." "Well, you did offer to be a nanny." "And I meant it," she said, wondering if that was why he was concerned about how she felt. She was still confused, and waited while he gathered his thoughts and then began to speak. "That day in the lighthouse, the day that you told me that I needed to live for more than myself, that I should do something good in the world, it really hit a nerve. You didn't know it, but I had been struggling with just those thoughts and feelings. Like, nothing that I have done in my life really mattered at all. I mean, I always tried to do good, be kind to people, and everything like that, but I had never actually spent my time, my spare time, on anything but myself. In fact, I guarded it pretty judiciously, feeling like I deserved a break. That seems to be the prevailing wisdom of the day, that you work hard and then you deserve time off, relaxing time, whatever." "That's true. I think God wants us to relax some." "I think our society, and humans in general, take it too far. We think we do a lot of work, but actually we're just working for ourselves." "I think that's true." "I didn't think I was going to get an argument from you." "You're not," she said, and they smiled at each other, before his expression grew serious again. It felt like there was something in the air between them, something sharp and crackly. She wasn't sure exactly what it was, but it made the hair on the back of her neck stick up, and her breath came more shallowly than what was comfortable. She waited impatiently, trying to allow him the time to find the words he needed. The kids have been a blessing to me this winter. They helped me shave off some of my rough edges. Or maybe more accurately, they showed me that I have a lot more rough edges than what I thought I did.
Kids do that.
Yeah, he said, lifting a brow, his expression saying that it was an understatement. He pursed his lips, looking over her shoulder before he met her gaze again. I struggled with the idea of being a single dad. I keep thinking that it's not fair to the children, but part of me thinks that maybe I'm being selfish. Maybe I don't really want to make that kind of commitment. Maybe I want to go back to the way it used to be, where I had all the time I wanted to do whatever I wanted to do. Around work, of course. But I love my work, and doing extra work really was no hardship. It was definitely for me. Because I can never use all the money I was making. What does one man need with all that money? 90% of the people in the world live on a lot less. I didn't need it.
I think sometimes we think we need a lot more money than what we actually do.
Or maybe I just love making it. I love the feeling of satisfaction, like I accomplished something, when, in reality, it doesn't really matter.
For eternity. It doesn't matter for eternity.
Right.
She waited, since this didn't seem to be his point. But she had no idea what he was leading up to.
I guess I could talk all day about that. But the thing that I came to the conclusion is that I really wanted the children. I want to adopt them. But I don't want to do it alone.
You want a wife, she said, as she tried to keep the
hurt, disappointment, sadness out of her voice. Yes. She stared at him for a little bit, wondering if he was going to ask her to help him find one. She almost snorted at the thought. He had been in the upper echelons of Chicago society for decades. He wasn't going to need her help to find one. He could find one on his own. Or ask one of his business associates. There were probably women lined up in rows who would be honored to be on his arm. She didn't know anything about that life, and she didn't know any women in Strawberry Sands, other than herself, of course, who would be wife material for Pierce. And if he thought she was good wife material, he wouldn't be asking her to help him find one.
I think that's a good idea, she said slowly.
You do?
Yes, you're right about the children needing a mother, and I can't argue with that.
The problem is, the children have kept me from pursuing the woman I want. I don't know how she feels about me, and I can't exactly find out when all of my time and energy has been spent taking care of the kids and doing the bit of business that I have left.
I see.
She still did not understand where she fit into this. But in today's society, people don't exactly get married for any reason other than love. That seems to be the benchmark of what constitutes a reason to get married. Anything else seems to be frowned upon, I guess.
Maybe that's a little crazy.
That seems like the dumbest thing to use to base a lifetime commitment on, the way a person feels in the moment.
Yeah, she said,
Although there was a part of her that wanted a man to marry her because he loved her enough to want to make a lifetime commitment to her. But maybe her idea of love and the world's idea were two different things. Since the world's idea seemed more like lust or infatuation, she wanted a love that would stand the test of time. That hadn't been what she had for her life, though, and she had mostly come to terms with that. A lifetime love just wasn't something she was going to get. "You don't agree?" he asked, apparently not convinced by the tone of her voice.
To some extent. I don't think that what I think about love and what the world thinks about love are the same, but I do think that for women especially, there needs to be an emotion involved.
They don't want a clinical, "we're going to commit to each other and stay committed no matter what"?
She laughed a little at his description. No, I think women want a little bit more romance.
Women don't have dibs on romance.
I know, but in general, it seems like it's more important to the female gender than it is to the male.
I guess I can't argue with that, but I kind of want romance.
Kind of.
I'd rather have commitment, loyalty, fidelity. Someone that I can depend on and who is stable and not twisting me around in circles as I try to do what she wants and have what she wants change every day.
Some women are like that.
Yeah, I've experienced that, and I'm not interested in going back down that road.
Maybe at our age there are a lot of people who aren't interested in going back down that road, or going down the romance road at all. It can leave scars when it doesn't work out.
Like it has for you? He asked, his eyes seeming to see past the front that she usually put up. She didn't want to say it was a front. She was happy. But he was right. There were scars. There was hurt and sadness and disappointment. The sense of deep sadness that something she'd valued so highly, something she'd worked on so hard in her life, hadn't turned out the way she wanted it to.
I guess, she finally said.
That makes me a little nervous.
What?
She asked, her mind coming back to the present after traveling down memory lane where she typically didn't walk. Because I was hoping that you would agree to marry me and raise these children together. With me. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.